the fact that the Christian ecumenical world, by and large, converted to Islam. The great patriarchal cities, Antioch, Jerusalem itself, Alexandria, eventually Constantinople, these are all now Muslim cities. Of course, Jerusalem is contested, but historically that's been the reality. How could that happen? The most ancient and pious Christian peoples anywhere go over to Islam. I mean, they weren't treated equally, but it's not a question of inquisitions and persecutions. Still Christians there in many of those countries. Often they have a hard time, but they can hold on to their faith if they want to. How did that happen? Well, the only explanation I can offer is that it is the book, the revelation, the text, and a text that proposed something that clearly pushed them in their most vulnerable spot, which was doctrine and Christology. That the Christian Near East and North Africa were just coming out of centuries of very profound and rancorous arguments over the Trinity and particularly the nature of Christ. And still people are divided. Some of them are diaphysite historians. There's lots of sects, there's lots of bad blood in the air. And when Islam comes with this kind of pared down, puritanical monotheism, this Judaism to the world, somehow it seems to be pushing them in that most vulnerable spot, and they trade off to Islam. They're still Muslim to this day. That's one indication of, firstly, the gigantic power of the monotheistic idea, the most powerful idea in history, and also the integrity with which the Quran is expressing it. Those people were really deeply religious. This is the land of the Desert Fathers and St. Cyril and those serious people. They come to Islam not for trivial reasons, but because they see in the Quran something that is like something fallen from heaven. They have to see it in that way. But the actual content of the Quran, to get back to my story, which talks about the earlier religions, is actually not very detailed. The main focus of the Quran is not constructing complicated ways of resolving the dual nature of Christ. In a very monotheistic, scriptural way, it magisterially just cuts through it by stating the alternative. God is straightforwardly, rather than complicatedly, one. Most of the Quran is not polemic against other religions. It's polemic against the Arabs and telling them to sort themselves out. If anything, the Quran is a polemic on behalf of the Arabs' neighbours against what's indigenously Arab. It doesn't have anything positive to say about it. They're not a chosen people. They have no special role in history. They're idolaters. They don't believe in life after death. They have to sort themselves out. And the general story of the neighbouring monotheisms is the way they have to do it. It's not xenophobic, it's xenophiliac, if that's a word. The Quran is saying the Arab context is deeply in trouble. We need to see the monotheistic story, to reconnect with that. And that's probably the only case in world history where a major world religion has defied what's indigenous and reached for what is the broad worldview of neighbours, not by introducing Christianity or Judaism to Mecca, but by introducing the big monotheistic story, the stories of the Bible to Mecca, and generically the Judeo-Christian Abrahamic story is the Quran's central motif. That's also historically very unusual. But the Quran does contain certain key passages which have to guide all subsequent Muslim reflection on the other religions. In the case of Judaism, it doesn't condemn Jewish theology substantially. It condemns, following many of the prophetic voices of the Old Testament, Jewish rebellion against God's favour and God's law. It's very much in the tradition of Jeddah. Stiff-necked people who simply will not submit to the yoke of the law. And if they don't, God will whack them. That's one of the big themes of the Old Testament. It's in the Quran as well, and there are punishment stories in the Quran as in the books of the Hebrew prophets. But doctrinally, there's no particular worries there about Judaism, except for one verse, which is perplexing. Muslims often get this wrong, and it's important to be aware of it. A verse that says, the Christians have said Jesus is the Son of God, and the Jews say Uzair is the Son of God. Uzair ibn Allah. And that's all you get. That's the only Quranic denunciation of the Jewish belief. And what on earth is it about? Uzair, the Son of God. What kind of Jew believes that somebody called Uzair is the Son of God? On to his page after page. Sometimes they say it's Ezra the scribe, who arrogated to himself semi-divine prerogatives when re-establishing the text of the scriptures after the Babylonian exile. Uzair, Ezra, doesn't actually work if you look at the languages. The most likely theory, which has been developed by somebody called Gordon Newby and a number of other Western historians, is that actually it's not Ezra at all. It's about Metatron. Metatron, probably most of you have never encountered Metatron. In medieval rabbinical Judaism, it was assumed that in order to preserve the absolute, unqualified unity of the Godhead, you had to presuppose that there was a kind of secondary emanation of God that was the conscious, personal God that created the world and to whom you could pray. Almost like in some of the Greek philosophical systems, that the one has to be just the one and produces the world, and there is a subordinate demiurge that is more like a personal God. Metatron was indeed the object of worship of many medieval Jews. In Cambridge we have something called the Geniza collection, which is a huge treasure trove of medieval Jewish documents from Cairo. Many of them are prayers to Metatron, asking Metatron for various favours. So, according to Lord Newby and those of his school, and I think this is as good an explanation as we're likely to get, actually Uzair is, and you could demonstrate this, associated with the prophet Enoch, possibly the Quranic Idris, who is assimilated to Metatron in a lot of rabbinical piety. So when the Quran is saying, the Jews say, Uzair is the Son of God, it's saying they worship Metatron. And indeed, he is one of B'nai Elohim, one of the sons of God, one of the created angels in the medieval rabbinical system. You can call him a son of God. The Quran doesn't like that terminology. And some Jews didn't like it either. A group of Jews called the Karaites dismissed rabbinical Judaism as polytheistic because of this Metatron idea. So what's going on here is really not the Quran saying that Jews are a bunch of polytheists because they worship a son of God. Instead, the Quran is taking one Jewish side against another, in this case the Karaite view against the Rabbinite view. And you could say that there are Orthodox Jews today that continue to believe in Metatron and worship him, but it's not really mainline belief. You don't find it in the average school synagogue nowadays. It's a medieval aberration. The Quran's polemic is directed against that. It's not a blanket denunciation of the religion. There's a lot more about Christianity. Let me just read you some of the relevant verses. And it's difficult to establish the chronology, but that doesn't matter too much, because you can see that there's an evolution in the Quran's legal prescriptions, but there isn't an evolution in the Quran's doctrine, as far as anybody has been able to propose. So, for instance, some very affirmative verses, famously Surah 2, verse 62. Those who believe, here meaning the Muslims, and those who are Jews, and the Christians, and the Sabians, another category we don't need to bother about here. Whoever believes in God and the last day and acts uprightly, they have their reward from their Lord. Apparently a very affirmative, ironic statement. If they're Jews or Christians or Muslims, they believe in God, and at the last day, God will reward them. Another text, Surah 5, verse 82. You will certainly find the closest in love to the believers, Muslims, to be those who say, we are Christians. That is because among them are priests and monks, and because they are not proud. It seems to go even further here. It's saying the Christians are the people who love us the most, and it affirms here specifically their personnel, priests and monks. and because they're not proud. So again, very affirmative statement in the Quranic text. Surah 57, verse 27, we gave Jesus the gospel. Think about that one. And in the hearts of his followers set kindness and mercy. And monasticism, that they invented, we did not prescribe it for them, though they were only desiring to please God, but they did not follow it aright. That seems to be some kind of criticism now. They invented monasticism to please God, but they didn't follow it correctly. Surah 5, verse 14. With those who say we are Christians, we made a covenant, but they forgot a part of the admonition. So he stirred up discord and aversion among them until the day of resurrection. And that's another aspect of the Quranic critique of Christians, which is that they're disunited, discord and aversion amongst them. And in those ancient Christological disputes, it was often a matter of life and death, whether you believe that the Son, the Spirit proceeds from the Son and the Father, whether the Son and the Spirit both proceed from the Father. These are still big issues between the Orthodox and the Latin churches, and in the East there are other Christological possibilities which never made it to the West. So the images of their arguing amongst themselves. But most significantly, we find the Quran's theology of Christianity embedded in its very interesting, actually very beautiful, infancy narrative, Mary and Jesus. It's familiar if you're used to saying the Gospel of Luke, but also there's a kind of tweaking here which gives you a good insight into why the Quran and hence Islam is different. So, the Virgin Mary first appears. There is said to be more about the Virgin Mary in the Quran than in the Gospels. I've not actually done the calculation myself, but it's possible. She's a significant figure. Surah 3, verse 32. Her Lord accepted her graciously and made her grow in grace. Zechariah took charge of her. Whenever Zechariah entered the sanctuary to greet her, he found provisions beside her. He said, "O Mary, how have you found this?" She replied, "It is from God. God provides without reckoning for whomsoever he will." And the commentaries here expand on this. The idea is that her mother, St. Anne, had, out of gratitude to God, vowed that her child, who she was sure would be a boy, in that situation, she was sure it would be a boy, he's going to serve in the temple. And then the child is born, and it's female, and of course females aren't allowed into most of the temple. But still, she is, because of the importance of this vow, allowed to be the first woman who worships as a kind of nun, I guess, in the inner courts of the temple. And then the Quran develops this theme of her worshipping in her mihrab. And if you've been to the Dome of the Rock and to the chamber underneath it, you can see a place that they say is the mihrab of Mary, a place where supposedly she had her cell, her khalwa. And miracles are attributed to her. So this is something that looks a bit new. But then listen to this. This is Surah 19, which is actually named after Mary. 16 to 19. Mentioning the book of Mary when she withdrew from her people to an easterly place. This is all about the Annunciation, and it is a different story. She took before them a veil. Then we sent to her our spirit to appear to her as a man without fault. She said, "I take refuge with the merciful from you if you fear God." He said, "I am only the messenger of your Lord to give you a pure son." She said, "How may I have a son when no man has touched me and I was not unchaste?" He said, "Thus shall it be. Your Lord said, it is easy for me that we may make him a sign for the people and a mercy from us. It is a thing decreed." That's the Annunciation story. The angel Gabriel comes to the Virgin Mary and gives her the news of the child. Even less familiar is the actual story of the birth of Jesus himself. And here we don't get the three wise men, the three kings, the stable, the familiar Christmas tale. Surah 19, again, verse 30, "And the birth pangs drove her to the trunk of a tree. She said, 'Would that I had died before this and had been a thing forgotten.' Then he called to her from below her, 'Grieve not, your Lord has set before you a stream. Shake the trunk of the palm, and it will drop moist, ripe dates upon you. Another of her miracles, she's just given birth. She's on her own in the desert. She's under a palm tree, and the voice rather unhelpfully tells her to shake the palm tree so that the dates fall. Hardly likely, but they do indeed, and that's a sign of her submissiveness and her obedience, even in that desperate situation. A single mother in the desert, she obeys, and the fruit falls. A number of historians have pointed out that that's not in the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, but it does seem to be in some other early so-called apocryphal Christian texts. Something called the Infancy Gospel of James, for instance, has something like this. Stable and all that of God. Instead, she's out in the desert somewhere to the east of Jerusalem, on her own, facing, escaping the scandal, presumably. She's pregnant, but she's supposed to be this pious woman worshipping in the temple. And she gives birth beneath the palm tree. And then what happens is that on the same Quranic narrative, she comes back into Jerusalem, and even more unhelpfully, the voice has said, you have to keep the fast of silence for 3 days. What she needs to do is to explain, unlikely that might seem, exactly how she got pregnant, but she's actually not a fornicator, she's not even allowed to say anything. So she comes into the city of Jerusalem, and the commentators explain how she's there, and the scribes and the Pharisees are there. They want to stone her to death. And for Asharat Ilay, as the Quran continues, she points to the child. And the scribes and the Pharisees say, how can we talk to somebody who's a baby in arms, a baby in the cradle? Now you're really cracked. And then the baby speaks, and this is Jesus' first miracle in the Quran. The baby speaks. That's her miracle, that's his miracle, if you like. Is like neonatal, but his preaching already. Inni Abdullah, and this is where you get the Quran's, as it understands it, correction of all of those early Christological arguments. These are the texts that seem to have pushed those millions of Christians in the most tender place. These beautiful narratives. And Jesus himself says, Inni Abdullah, this is not St. Athanasius or anybody, it's Jesus himself, I am God's slave. It's the first thing the Quran wants to attribute to him. Atani al-Kitab, he has given me scripture. وَجَعَلَنِي نَبِيًّا, and has given and has made me a prophet. وَجَعَلَنِي مُبَارَكًا أَيْنَمَا كُنتُ, and has made me blessed wherever I may be. And he continues with this sermon. And if you've seen the Iranian film, based on the Quranic story of the Virgin Marriage, it's worth seeing. At that point, of course, that's the end of the film, because she's vindicated. Her trust in God, her obedience to the commandment not to speak, has been fully vindicated. The scribes and the Pharisees, who are basically kind of money changer types and want to stone her to death, are completely shattered by the fact that they've seen a miracle, and God and his new prophet are vindicated. And that really is the Christology of the Quran. He is created. He is servant of God. He receives a scripture and is blessed wherever he may be. But he's not very God, a very God. He's not a God-man. He's not a theanthropos. He can't be worshipped. The only other thing that one needs to add there is what then, following this, and that really is a criticism of the core Christian insight, Jesus was God. What subsequently is the orthodox, if there ever is quite such a thing, Muslim take on Christianity? Because here Christians really are saying, like the Jews, they are saying God has had a son. Are they idolaters? Because the pagan Arabs used to say our gods have children, like the Greeks and the Romans. The general view is no. It's a grievous error, possibly a fatal error, but it's not shirk, it's not polytheism. And the reason why the majority of the jurists conclude that is, if they were polytheists, they wouldn't be in the same category as the Jews. They wouldn't be Ahlul Kitab. You wouldn't be able to marry their women, you wouldn't be able to eat the meat that they slaughter, and they would be reduced to the category of the mushrikun, which is a much lower category in the Islamic social pecking order. So if God has said they are people of the book and you can marry their women, they're not idolaters. That generally has been the consensus. But still, here you have quite a swindling a swingeing criticism, if you like. After that, the story develops under Muslim polemic. Some of it is bitter and nasty, some of it is ironic, some of it is just medieval encyclopedists who like to write long descriptions of the doctrines prevalent in Baghdad in their time. So you have a chapter on the Nestorians, a chapter on the Chalcedonians, a chapter on the Jacobites, a chapter on the Copts, and sometimes it can be assessed quite objectively. Bringing the story up to date, and in many cases in the Muslim world that doesn't take very long because the Muslim world is so traditional and many things haven't changed. One could just close by mentioning the fact that this generally critical but ironic and inclusive Quranic idea of the Jewish and Christian realities has been continued just 2 or 3 years ago by this very well-known Muslim document called the Common Word, Kalimantan, which was issued by a group of leading Muslim scholars, 138 of them, in the aftermath of a speech that Pope Benedict XVI gave in Regensburg, which offended a lot of Muslims and some non-Muslim scholars as well, which affirms the importance of what we hold in common, which is love of God and love of neighbour. It doesn't propose a reform or a revision. It doesn't propose any kind of reduction of the differences. But the phrase common word comes from a Quranic invitation, which is what Muslims are supposed to say to Jews and Christians, which is Surah 3, verse 64. Say, O people of the Scripture, come to a common word between us and you, that we shall worship none but God, and that we shall ascribe no partner unto him, and that none of us shall take others for lords beside God. And if they turn away, then say, bear witness that we are they who have surrendered unto him. So this idea of common word, Kalimatun Sawa, is taken to be a Quranic basis for a possible Abrahamic lowest common denominator front against some of the negative consequences of today's world. And one of the consequences of the Common Word Initiative was the World Interfaith Harmony Week, which the United Nations General Assembly recently voted into existence, which I think is the first week in February. All kinds of events are being held around the world on the basis not of some kind of liberal decision, but actually we're all the same sort of thing with marginal differences. That generation of interfaith diplomacy, I think, has been left behind, but a more mature awareness that given the common threat that we all face, which is the spirit of negation and absence of meaning which characterises many people in the modern world, there are grounds for cooperation, for a common word, for saying certain things in common, which are essentially the Abrahamic ideas of faith in God, belief in his existence, in his benign mercy, in the end of time, in heaven, in hell, of the reality of human accountability, the fundamental common denominators of monotheism, which, as I suggested at the outset, are probably the things that they all consider to be most important. I've been going on for much too long. I have a train to catch at some point, but perhaps we've got 10 or 15 minutes for questions, if anybody has any questions.
What about the rest of the world? I mean, why did Europe subsequently become this? Why did it stop? France?
Well, the Europeans like becoming Muslim, but it was we're just a bit slower in some things. Obviously, the fact that the Arabs had conquered, subjugated large areas, made it easier for Islam to spread, because Muslim scholars could operate there without fear of persecution. If you converted to Islam in Umayyad Spain, you could be a lot more confident of your future than if you did so under, say, Charlemagne in France. Just a matter of knowledge. There is evidence that there were people elsewhere in Europe converting to Islam. The Muslims in Hungary, for instance, several centuries before the Ottoman invasions, there were always people converting to Islam, small groups of them in England. In the 16th century, for instance, there are court records that indicate that 3 people in Wales were put to death for converting to Islam. Odd pieces of information here and there, but most of them, I think, have kept it pretty quiet. Anyway, it's a work in progress.
This is going to be kind of an abstract question, but do you think that subscribing to pluralism, or the idea that there is going to be inevitably multiple perspectives in any given community, that also sort of leans one towards secularization as well, that they kind of go hand in hand? And I guess, just to kind of follow up with what you think about a statement like that, with the most recent uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt that may bring about a sort of democratization of both nations, do you think we're about to see some pretty radical changes?
2 different questions.
Yeah, I guess.
That's important. The first one is, there's a certain type of hard pluralism that's associated with some philosophers of religion, like John Hick and others that I've heard of, who say, because God is absolutely other than ourselves, our mental images of him are inadequate and reflect our own culture and our own language. Therefore, I might be praying to God as Allah, a Christian might be praying to God as Jesus, and these are all relative projections upon what ultimately are knowable. It's a widespread view. But as you suggest, that can be very secularizing, because if the divine reality is beyond any kind of characterization, it might as well not exist. And you're saying that all of the religions, you could say, are equally right, but you're also saying they're equally wrong. The Christian can worship God as Jesus, but that's not really how things are at the top. The Muslim can worship Allah with the 99 angels, that's not the truth of the affair. So it can be very secularizing. Hume thought about this about 2.5 centuries ago. If the beyond, the numinal God, to use Kant's language, is beyond any kind of qualification, and we just struggle to express things about him, it must well not exist. It's a deus gratuitosus, it's an unnecessary God. All we have is relative construction. I think that's true. As far as Egypt and Tunisia are concerned, well, we shall see what the end game is. The only thing that's come out of it for sure is that our politicians are excellent hypocrites. I really liked the Tunisian moment where one day Sarkozy was offering the Tunisian Prime Minister 300% riot release. The next day, when the game was up, he wouldn't even allow him into his airspace. Western help is very conditional upon the existence of Western interests. And it's the same with Egypt. Everybody knows who made the tear gas in Tahrir Square. It's all supplied free of charge by the United States. But Obama is saying, we're with the people of Egypt, this is a new dawn, etc. The only one who's been true to his principles has been Tony Blair, who supported Mubarak throughout. The others secretly are hoping he'll win, but Tony Blair is saying, yes, he's a great guy, he's misunderstood him. But where it will go, I don't know. The Egyptian army has been trained for this scenario for the last 30 years. They haven't been armed by ourselves and the Americans so that they could go to war with Israel, but so they could deal with internal difficulties. So all of this is a scenario they've trained for. And what has actually happened so far, all that has happened is that a general in a suit has left to be replaced by a general in a uniform. Whether this will be good for the country or not, we'll see. We'll see if their promises are sincere or not. Okay, who's next?
I had a question about the Arabian Prophets. The ones mentioned in the Quran that argue from the Jewish and Christian tradition. And I wanted to ask if this is a real departure from the way that Judaism and Christianity see prophethood, and if it doesn't allow for Islam to define itself in new ways with different religious ideas, because it has a way of incorporating prophets that weren't specifically defined. You might mention just one or two that are unknown, but opening the door to the possibility of more historically.
Yeah, that's something perhaps I should have referred to. One of the things that the Quran is doing that you could say is new from a biblical perspective is proposing that every people has had at some point in its past access to the divine. The Quran says, equally holding had, for every people has been a guide. وَمَا مِنْ أُمَّةٍ إِلَّا خَلَا فِيهَا نَذِيرٌ. Every nation has had at some point in its past a prophetic warner. So the fact that there's non-biblical prophets mentioned in the Quran is an example of that. Muslims, when they went to India, for instance, which is full of all kinds of spectacular religious stuff that doesn't seem to be envisaged in the Quran and the Hadith, weren't particularly fazed by it because they assumed somewhere at the background of the world there must have been a prophet. So some of the scholars of Bengal, for instance, said Krishna probably was a prophet but was radically misunderstood. There's even, and this is in somebody called Shahrastani, who's a major medieval Muslim writer on different religions and sects, the idea that the word Brahmin is a corruption of the word Abraham. But he liked to see it as originally a monotheistic tradition that was then led astray into a polytheistic direction. And that idea of universal apostleship is something that's quite characteristically Quranic. Judaism, God is with the chosen people, that doesn't necessarily reject everyone else, but the real story of our prophets. Then Christianity comes as a prophecy is kind of old hat, and now we have God in the flesh, and we don't need the law and the prophets. Islam says, yes, it is the prophets, but not the prophets of a particular chosen people, but everybody at some point is a prophet. I suppose at some point there was even an English prophet. You can imagine such a person could be. I don't think the English national temperament is particularly Another question?
Any questions from the ladies? Okay, sister.
Yeah, I've never understood why you said that the Orthodox scholars never said that Christianity was shirk, but why would, for example, Vedantic Hinduism with believing in avatars, it sounds very similar to what the Christians say. Why is one shirk and one not?
Well, it wasn't necessarily, because the Hanafi scholars in India said Hinduism cannot be assimilated to the old category of Arab paganism. But they're not Ahl al-Kitab because they don't have a scripture in the sense that monotheists would recognize. So they were classified as Ahl al-Dhimma, but not Ahl al-Kitab, which meant that they were protected and they had a legal covenant, they could continue to worship and have their transactions. But they weren't considered to be a community with which you could intermarry. So they weren't straightforwardly assimilated to a category of polytheists. And somebody like Biruni, who's one of the Abbasid intellectuals, goes to India and learns Sanskrit and sits with the Pandits, says, actually, from a certain perspective, you can say these people do believe in the unity of the absolute. But for the masses, they've really lost sight of it because they're focusing almost exclusively on less manifestations of divinity. And very often, more intelligent monotheistic criticisms of polytheism tend to go that way, because a true polytheism is very unusual. Most polytheisms believe that there is some supreme principle above the various godlings. Even the ancient Romans have that idea. But the more profound monotheistic critique of polytheism is that it's so easy to misunderstand. You're so interested in Minerva and Jupiter and Mercury and the other ones that you tend very easily to forget that they're just mediators. They're just representations of an ultimate principle, so you can fall into idolatry very easily. But it's not correct that, say, Vedantic Hinduism should be regarded as polytheistic, because it emerged to deny that. Some forms of popular Hinduism, I think, probably are. Hinduism is not a single thing.
Could you not argue that about popular Christianity?
Yeah.
That most popular Christians don't understand the detailed theology of the Trinity?
Yes, that's right. And it's in the letters of Calvin. He said, I can understand why praying to St. Catherine is not idolatrous, but in reality, your average villager thinks that she's some kind of godlike figure, and he forgets about Jesus, so that's idolatrous. And the Trinity as well can be the same. My own belief is that, properly understood, and it's very difficult to understand, the Trinity can be conceived of as a monotheistic doctrine. But it's so easy to misunderstand that very often, I think functionally churchgoers do believe in three gods, which would be my main criticism of the doctrine. and also the inherent difficulty of imputing threeness to the ultimate. How are we doing?
I think that's all the time.
Is that it? Okay, thanks very much. Thanks everyone.